So if you would like, flip to 1 Samuel. We will be spending time in the Old Testament tonight. I'll give you a little bit of the background about why I picked this passage, 1 Samuel 14. We'll be looking at verses 1 through 24. So on Monday nights, we do a Bible study, a small Bible study at my wife's parents' house. And gosh, about a year and a half ago, somebody suggested we kind of finished the book that we were currently going through, and somebody said, well, why don't we go over the historical section of the Old Testament? That would be helpful for us. And so I said, okay, well, we'll start in Judges, and we'll just go through until we get to 2 Kings, and just attempt to kind of better understand how the Old Testament connects together. And as we were doing this study, we came to this passage in 1 Samuel 14. And usually people think of 1 Samuel as Saul and as David, and we really kind of associate with passages that we're familiar with David. 1 Samuel 17, David and Goliath is one of the really common ones that we think of in 1 Samuel. But as we studied this particular chapter, a couple of themes kind of jump out. The first theme is the great fear of the people of Israel that they have in this confrontation, which we'll talk about. And as we kind of think about how we live life, we find out that oftentimes fear is the thing that dominates our decisions. Oftentimes fear drives us to make decisions that aren't the best decisions that we should make as believers. Another theme that we'll talk about in the chapter is the humility required for faith to work. So in this chapter, we're going to see Jonathan come to a place where there's no hope that he's going to achieve success on his own. He realizes the situation is well beyond his ability to deal with. And he makes this great statement of faith. And so we'll look for that in the passage. And then the final theme that we'll look at tonight is the theme of encouragement in the community. We'll see how Jonathan is living out his faith in the midst of the nation of Israel who is consumed with, dominated by fear. And we'll see Jonathan's small act of living out his faith lead to the encouragement of the nation as a whole. In fact, it leads to the nation turning from their fear and turning to God. So these are the themes that we will see in 1 Samuel 14. Now, I realize it might be quite a long time since you've visited these chapters, and so I'd like to introduce you for a little while here to the historical setting that we find ourselves in. This is early during the reign of Saul. He is the first king of Israel. He is selected by the people. The people come to God at the end of the prophet Samuel's life, and they say, your children are grown up. They don't follow God like you do. Give us a king. Put a king over us. Samuel is furious at this demand of the people. God says, don't worry, they're not rejecting you, Samuel. They're rejecting me from being king over them. The people insist on having a king appointed over them. They give 3 conditions for this. They want to be like the nations. They want the king to go in and out before them, to lead them, to be an example to them. They also want the king to fight their battles for them. Somewhat ironically, these are all the things which God has declared he would do for the people. Right? And this is how we live as humans. We typically try to find replacements for God's work in human things. And as it goes, this doesn't work out well for us when we try to replace things that only God can do with human institutions. There's some early success in the life of Saul. He goes out and he defeats this roving band of Ammonites who come in. They threaten a city called Jabesh Gilead. Nahash, the leader of the Ammonites, comes in and he threatens to cut out all the eyes of the people of the city if they don't obey him. Saul places his faith in God. He gathers the people of Israel and he goes and he drives away this Ammonite usurper. Afterwards, he gathers about 3,000 men to be his standing army. So these 3,000 men go with him wherever he is. But this isn't the end of the conflict that Israel will face. To the west of the nation of Israel, there's this hilly country which is called the Shephelah. It served as a border between Israel and their main antagonists throughout this period, the Philistines. The Philistines were known for being a great and numerous people. They had giants who lived among them. We'll see one of those in 1 Samuel chapter 17 with David and Goliath. These same Philistines were part of the reason that the people of Israel refused to go into the land when God first led them up. They said, we don't want to go in there. The people are much greater than us, much more powerful than us. There's people who are 10 feet tall who fight in their armies. We don't want to go up in there. So there's conflict between Israel and the Philistines during the days of Saul. One of Saul's sons, Jonathan, during this time goes out and he defeats a small garrison of the Philistines in a border town called Geba. This takes place in the preceding chapter, 1 Samuel 13. This small border town, which is defeated by Jonathan, causes a major international incident, as we would say today. The Philistines gather all the hosts of their armies, and they march up through the hill country to come and to put down what's seen as an Israelite rebellion. The Philistine host, their armies, is characterized with a large number of chariots and horsemen. And the number of the soldiers that comes up with them is described as like the sand that's on the seashore. It says the Philistines come into the land. Their armies spread out like a cloud of locusts. They sweep over the towns in the border between Israel and the Philistine lands. And the greatness of their army just begins to consume all of the food that the Israelites have. It begins to just fill the land with the enemy. As if that wasn't enough, the Philistines have been oppressing the Israelites for years at this point. 1 Samuel 13, 20 through 22 tells us that as part of this oppression, the Philistines had taken all of the blacksmiths, anyone who could make weapons or work with iron. They had taken all of the blacksmiths out of the land, and they had brought them down into the land of the Philistines. This was to make sure that Israel could not equip itself for war. We're told in 1 Samuel 13, 20 through 22 that when the day of battle came, there were no weapons in the hands of the Israelites except for Jonathan and his father Saul. And so you can imagine, you can see the picture of this great conflict that the Israelites face, this overwhelming superiority of the Philistine host, the greatness of the Philistine warriors, and the complete lack of equipment that the Israelites have to be able to deal with the problem. The Israelites are literally going into battle with farm equipment. And so Saul issues the command. He sends out the call to the nation to gather all the men to come to battle. And when the soldiers of Israel get there, they begin to quake in fear. They flee. They go forth and they hide anywhere that they can find a place to cover themselves and crouch in the darkness out of sight. We are told that they hide in cisterns, in the places where water is stored up. They hide in caves deep into the forest. It says they become so desperate even that they crawl down into the tombs to hide from the Philistine enemies. We don't like to think of fear as something which drives us to such extremes, but today we often live in the same type of fear. We see the enemy, we see the trial, we see the tribulation. And in great fear, we abandon everything that we know to hide. It gets so bad that the Israelites don't stop just by hiding in the land, but they also abandon the land of promise, the land that God said, I will establish you firmly in. They get up, they leave, they move, they run across the Jordan, and they flee into the wilderness because of the fear that they have. This fear drives them, it consumes them, it distracts them from the truth that they can rely on God to save them. Right? And again, we maybe don't face this same fear of Philistine hosts marching into our land today, but we certainly deal with fear and its distractions from our reliance on God. Of all the men that Saul had commissioned to come to battle with him, he starts with his 3,000 soldiers, which are his permanent bodyguard, but it says he summons all Israel. Of all the men that he gathers, only 600 remain. Small troop is left. Right? And even these men are hiding in a cave with their king. In the lead up to chapter 14, we also see the foolishness and fear of the king himself. Saul, who's supposed to lead the people, he's supposed to go out before them, he's supposed to fight their battles. He was told by Samuel the prophet, this would be a sign for you. You're to go down to fight against the Philistines. You're to wait 7 days. And on the seventh day, I will come, we'll make a sacrifice, we'll inquire after the Lord. It's 1 Samuel 10:8. Saul waits most of the 7 days. But like us, it's that last little bit of waiting that usually causes us to falter. And so on the seventh day, Saul decides that Samuel isn't coming. God has not kept his word. And so Saul makes the sacrifice himself, which he was not allowed to do. It says Samuel immediately shows up as Saul was finishing making the sacrifice and then condemns him for his disobedience against the word of the Lord. And so what we see here, again, with the fear of the people, the abandonment of God's promise, the fear of the king himself, and the disobedience of God's word, we see the problem that we face with fear, that it casts doubt on God's faithfulness. That when we let fear be the thing that consumes and drives us in all of our decisions, it doesn't drive us to God, it drives us away from him. As Nate was talking about on Sunday, the only acceptable form of fear is fear of God, fear of the Lord, recognition of his power and his ability to save, to deliver. So that's the introduction to our chapter here tonight, the great fear of Israel and the great trial that they face. So let's go ahead. We're going to read verse 1 through 24, and then we're going to work our way through it. I have my phone up here so we make sure we won't go too late tonight. All right, so starting verse 1. One day Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to the young man who carried his armor, "Come, let us go over to the Philistine garrison on the other side." But he did not tell his father. Saul was staying in the outskirts of Gibeah in the pomegranate cave at Migron. The people who were with him were about 600 men, including Ahijah, the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, son of Phinehas, son of Eli, the priest of the Lord in Shiloh. He was wearing an ephod. And the people did not know that Jonathan had gone. Within the passes by which Jonathan sought to go over to the Philistine garrison, there was a rocky crag on one side and a rocky crag on the other side. The name of the one was Bozez, and the name of the other was Seneh. The one crag rose on the north in front of Michmash, and the other on the south, which is in front of Geba. This is what separated the Philistine armies from the armies of Israel, these 600 men. And Jonathan said to the young man who carried his armor, "Come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised." I want you to think carefully about what he says next. This is kind of the central part of the passage. Look at what Jonathan says. He's saying, let's go over to this garrison of this huge army. And he says this: it may be that the Lord will work for us. For nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few. And his armor bearer said to him, "Do all that is in your heart. Do as you wish. Behold, I am with you, heart and soul." And then Jonathan said, "Behold, we will cross over to the men. We will show ourselves to them. If they say to us, 'Wait until we come to you,' then we will stand still in our place, and we will not go up to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' then we will go up, for the Lord has given them into our hand. And this shall be the sign to us." So both of them showed themselves to the garrison of the Philistines, and the Philistines said, "Look, the Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they have hidden themselves." And the men of the garrison hailed Jonathan and his armor bearer and said, "Come up to us, and we will show you a thing." And Jonathan said to his armor bearer, "Come up after me, for the Lord has given them into the hand of Israel." Then Jonathan climbed up on his hands and his feet, and his armor bearer after him. And they fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer killed them after him. And that first strike which Jonathan and his armor bearer made killed about 20 men within about half a furrow's length of an acre of land. And there was a panic in the camp and in the field and among all the people. The garrison and even the raiders trembled. The earth quaked, and it became a very great panic. And the watchmen of Saul and Gibeah of Benjamin looked, and behold, the multitude was dispersing here and there. Then Saul said to the people who were with him, "Count and see who has gone out from us." And when they had counted, behold, Jonathan and his armor bearer were not there. So Saul said to Ahijah, "Bring the ark of God here," for the ark of God went at that time with the people of Israel. Now while Saul was talking to the priest, the tumult in the camp of the Philistines increased more and more. So Saul said to the priest, "Withdraw your hand." Then Saul and all the people who were with him rallied and went into battle. And behold, every Philistine sword was against his fellow, and there was a very great confusion. Now the Hebrews who had been with the Philistines at that time, who had gone up with them into the camp, even they also turned to be with the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. Likewise, when all the men of Israel who had hidden themselves in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were fleeing, they too followed hard after them in battle. So the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle passed beyond Beth Aven. It doesn't take a whole lot of faith for us to step out from fear and to be used by God to work a great deliverance. The people fear the Philistine armies, and they lack trust in God. So they flee from the promised land, they abandon their king, and they hide. They also join the enemy. When we give this power to fear, we find ourselves in places that we never would have guessed we would stoop to. Have you ever found yourself giving so much power to fear that you end up supporting the very thing that you know is wrong? This happens all the time. Right? We wonder why some churches today have gone and begun to support gay rights. Right? We wonder why we've fallen so far from the American church, from the truths of the Bible as a whole. Right? Even the king here loses heart and lacks trust in God's promises. Look at where he's sitting. Saul, too, is staying in the outskirts of Gibeah in a pomegranate cave. This proud king, this leader of God's people, the one who is to be an example to the nation, who is to lead them out in battle, is hiding in a cave. Oftentimes we allow fear to incapacitate us. And seemingly from a human perspective for good reason. Right? It can be a difficult relationship. It can be the struggle with sickness. Right? The situation can seem hopeless. Right? But through it all, as Christians, we're told we don't need to fear. Why? Because God is with us. The Israelites here had more than enough evidence that God was faithful and was able to deliver. Anybody remember what some of those pieces of evidence are?
The crossing the Red Sea, the entrance into the Promised Land, the defeat of the Moabites and the Ammonites, it's time and time again.
Yeah. So one of these instances, God literally split the ocean apart, dried out the land, and the people walked through it with the wall of water on one side and the wall of water on the other. I think Seth's going to talk about this on Sunday, so we won't spend too much time there. This huge Egyptian army was defeated by God as the slaves which he had oppressed for 400 years walked up out of the land of promise. God went before them in a cloud of smoke by day and a pillar of fire by night. God split the Jordan. He allowed them to cross over on the Jordan. They literally walked around the city of Jericho 7 days in a row, and on the seventh day, they blew a couple of trumpets and the walls fell down. Over and over and over again throughout the period of the judges, they disobeyed. God sent an enemy against them. They repented. God sent the deliverer and defeated the enemy. Gideon defeats an army of 130,000 with 300 men who lap water out of their hands like a dog. For us, the story doesn't end there, right? For the people of Israel here, that's kind of the breadth of the historical situation that they have. We have even more evidence that God is faithful. Like Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they stood firm in faith. God delivered them from a fiery furnace that was so hot it killed the people who threw them in there. Even more than that, God himself, Jesus, came down on the earth to die for our sins, to deliver us. And yet, like the Israelites here, we often find ourselves still caving into fear. Right? Why do we do this? It's because we take our eyes frequently off the God who is our deliverer. Fear attempts to convince us in these moments of trial that God either, one, does not care about us and isn't going to intervene, or two, does not have the power to deliver us. Both of these things are lies. Right? Both of these things we need to recognize as lies when they are whispered into our heads. Right? God certainly does care about you. And he certainly does have the power to deliver and to save. Right? So if you ever find yourself thinking that for some reason God just isn't bothered to be concerned with you or isn't capable of intervening in a situation, recognize that as a lie. As an engineer, oftentimes the thing I struggle with the most is relationships. Go figure, right? Stereotype of engineer is not good at being in relationships. And so one of the things I will frequently find myself doing is looking at the broken pieces of a relationship or the miscommunication, whatever it may be, and saying, wow, this is beyond repair. I'm just going to give up on it. Right? What I'm doing in that is saying, I don't trust that God can somehow take these pieces, which I have done my best to scatter in my sinful self, and fix them. Again, that's a lie. So we see here in the situation that the Israelites face, seeing this great and overwhelming army filling the land, we see ourselves acting in that same way in different circumstances. All right, now let's contrast to Saul, who's hiding in fear with the rest of his army, with Jonathan. Jonathan makes this statement, come, let us go over to the garrison of the Philistines. And if we didn't have more information, we might say, is he defecting too, even the king's son? But he's not. He's not defecting. He's going over in hope. He's stepping out in faith. We see this in verse 6. Jonathan says to the young man who carried his armor, come, let us go over to the garrison of the uncircumcised, for it may be that God will work for us. When you experience a trial, you have a couple of choices that you can make. You can give up on trying to get through the trial. You can hide in the cave. You can flee. Say, this isn't for me, I'm done. Or you can choose to act in faith, that God is going to lead you through the trial, and not only just lead you through the trial, but use the trial, as James tells us, to build up and bring to completion your faith in him. God does not send trials for no purpose. God uses the trials to strengthen your faith. Right? You never know how the trial today is going to prepare you for the work that God has for you tomorrow. Jonathan here chooses to act in faith. But notice how he acts. He doesn't say, this is exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to march over here. I'm going to wipe out 20 people, and then the whole army is just going to flee. What does he say? What does Jonathan say? Yeah. He says, it may be that the Lord will work for us, right? And we see here humility in how Jonathan proceeds. Contrast this with how we often like to approach problems. Oftentimes we'll find we pray this way, and I'm guilty of this, so I'm not pointing the finger at anybody else, but I'll use myself here as an example. Sometimes when I'm facing trials, I like to pray, Lord, fix it this way. Do this thing, then this thing, and then this thing, so that it works out in the way that I intend, so that it comes to this exact resolution. And by the way, if you decide you're going to do it some other way, I'm probably going to be grumpy that you picked this other way to do it, right? Now, it sounds kind of silly, right? But this, again, is often how we approach wanting God to intervene to help us through trials. We often want to be the ones to prescribe how he goes about delivering. Instead, we would be much better served if we cast all of our cares on him and let him bring the situation to his resolution. Because his resolution is not only better in the moment, he's not only a better planner than you are, he's not only far more familiar with the people who are involved in the situation than you are, he's not only more powerful than we are, more imaginative than we are, more long-seeing than we are. God brings his plans to completion not for temporary benefit, like we want, but for eternal benefit. And so we would be really well served to say, God, bring this to your planned completion, not mine. Right? This is essentially what Jonathan here is saying. It may be in this situation God is ready to deliver. It may be in this situation that stepping out in faith here, going up to the camp of the Philistines, that God will take these two men and use it to bring about the beginnings of deliverance for his people. Not a deliverance from a small foe, but from a foe who is literally described as numerous as the sand on the sea. And Jonathan is saying, myself and my armor bearer, the two of us, we're going to go up, and it may be that God will work to bring about his deliverance. And we say, Jonathan, how can you say that? How can you believe that the two of you are going to have any kind of impact against this army that is filling the land? And Jonathan gives us the answer. He gives this profound statement of faith and of belief in who God is and what he can do. And this is why I say repeatedly, this is one of my favorite passages in the Old Testament. I say that about a lot of passages, so that maybe dilutes it a little bit. But Jonathan makes this statement about who God is. For nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few. And this becomes even more profound for us when we look to Jesus. Hebrews 10:12-14 tells us that Jesus offered himself one sacrifice for all eternity. Jesus, the one God, man, died himself on the cross, and with his blood solved the problem of the ocean of our sins permanently. For all eternity. Right. This same faith that Jonathan has in saying nothing can hinder the Lord from delivering by many or by few is the same faith that we have today in the work of Jesus. That he himself died on the cross. He alone lived the perfect life, could bear our sins, die on the cross, and in his death reunite us with God. Solve the issue of sin. We have the same faith that Jonathan has. Jonathan is applying it to the situation of fighting the Philistines who are oppressing Israel. Jesus, the faith that we have in him, is applied to the eternal battle that we have with sin today. And he is victorious, even as God here can be victorious with the simple act of faith of two men. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few. How many of you would find that encouraging enough to say, I'll run into battle? It gets even more humorous when we look and we realize Jonathan is equipped. He's well equipped. He's the son of the king. He has armor and a sword. But his armor bearer is with him who doesn't. He's carrying Jonathan's armor. And he says, I'll go with you, while carrying his farm instruments into battle, right? And in this, we see in Jonathan's armor bearer, notice what he says here. He says, do all that is in your heart. Do as you wish. Behold, I am with you, heart and soul. We see the great encouragement that we can have in facing trials from brothers and sisters in the faith, right? It's not likely the armor bearer here is saying, yeah, Jonathan, I believe that you can defeat every single soldier in this great army of the Philistines. But he's saying, Jonathan, I will be with you in your faith as you act in faith that God is the one who can deliver. We need brothers and sisters like this in Christ to help us when we're going through trouble, when we're going through trial, who can come along and encourage us, who can come along and point us to God, can go with us on the way. It's what the church is supposed to do today, to encourage one another, strengthen one another. If you're not a part of a small group or you don't get to intimately know other believers here at the church, you should. Look at how much of an encouragement this can be to Jonathan that his armor bearer is going with him. We see again Jonathan's humility here in allowing God to lead him. He tells his armor bearer, here's the plan. We're not just going to charge in here. eyes closed, seeking kind of the deliverance that we've imagined here, but we're gonna reveal ourselves to the Philistines, and then we'll let God work in the situation. If the Philistines tell us, come up, then we'll go up. And if they tell us stay, then we'll stay. And Jonathan says, if they say come up, we'll know that the Lord has given them into our hands, and we will go up courageously, up to the camp of the enemy. Oftentimes we being, I'll just use myself as an example again, kind of put our heads down and just like charge into the problem, right? And then I kind of find myself astounded when I like run into the door jamb, right, on the way in. Or find out that the house was on fire and it's really hot in there, right, as we kind of try to address our problems. Again, we can see Jonathan here allowing room for God to work. It may be that he's going to work for us. We'll go up, we'll see if he paves the way for us to go. Right. Again, this shows that Jonathan is more interested in God's plan for deliverance than he is in trying to prove his own bravado or his own skill. Because the deliverance that God can provide in this situation is orders of magnitude better than the deliverance that Jonathan can provide. Oftentimes, as we approach trials in life, we ask for God to give us an answer. Usually when we do that, the only answer that we want is the one that we think is going to resolve the situation the fastest. Often we close our hearts off to any other answer. Right? Part of the humility in submitting ourselves to God's will is being open to the answer that he gives. Realizing that in his eternal majesty, he often works in ways that we don't understand. And he often takes situations that seem hopeless and turns them miraculously into situations that accomplish far more than we could ever have imagined being accomplished. You know, one reason it's really great that God doesn't think like us is because we're way often wrong instead of right. So it kind of makes sense, doesn't it, that God doesn't work in the way that we think he should all the time. Right? We also would find out that we all think in different ways, right? And so if God was always working in the way that we thought, we'd always be in conflict, the same conflict that we find ourselves in because of the way that we think in selfishness or in fear. Right? So sometimes we need to take the time in trial, in fear, to simply take a deep breath and turn over that fear to God. That's what he tells us. Bring me all your fears, all your worries, and I will give you rest. Right? The rest that you can experience and know in God is a rest unlike any that you will ever experience anywhere else. The rest that you can have in Jesus is the assurance of eternal, of permanent salvation. That no matter how bad the situation gets here on earth, that God has resolved for all time, all problems. That when you place your faith in him, that ultimately you will dwell secure in his presence. Okay. Paul tells us in Romans chapter 8, he gives this evidence, his faith in what God can do in salvation. He declares it by saying, I count the present struggles of this life as nothing, even to be compared to the eternal glory that we have in Jesus. Right. The trial only seems small when we compare it to the majesty of God. If you're stuck in the trial comparing it to your ability to fix, it will invariably seem overwhelming. Just like Jonathan looking at this great army of the Philistines. If it was all up to him, the problem would be overwhelming. But again, Jonathan's not looking to himself to save Israel. He's looking to God. Verses 13 through 14, we see that God provides the opportunity, even as Jonathan said, we'll listen, we'll see if this is what God does. by having the Philistines tell us to come up, then we'll go up. Notice in these verses that Jonathan, when he's given the indication that God has made the way open, does he sit and say, maybe that was a poor decision to test God in this way? No, he acts. He goes up. They say, come up, and he turns to his armor bearer and he says, let's go up. God has given them over to us. When God gives you an opportunity, act. Right? He opens the door. He makes the way. Oftentimes, we choose not to act because we say, I don't have enough wisdom. That's okay. God says, if any of you lacks wisdom, ask, and I will give you more than you need. James chapter 1. Sometimes we say, I don't have the strength. That's okay. God tells us, I will give you strength so that you may raise up like eagles. Isaiah chapter 40. If you're lacking anything when God provides the opportunity to act, we're left with the great blessing that we can just simply ask and that he'll provide all that we need. Don't convince yourself not to act. Don't let fear back in. So Jonathan goes up, right? It says he fights against the small group of the Philistines who are on top of this hill. By the way, the hill is a short, difficult climb. It's a steep, rocky precipice. He climbs up. It's not always easy carrying out what God has provided for us to do, right? But he perseveres through that. He goes up. He fights these 20 men on top of the hill, and he defeats these 20 men. This would be a remarkable feat for a single warrior, even two warriors to accomplish. 10-to-1 ratio of victory is really good. But in the grand scheme of things, these 20 men are a drop in the bucket of the Philistine army. Right? Doesn't even move the needle a little bit with the problem that Israel is facing. This army like the sand that's on the seashore. The account in 1 Samuel 13 tells us that they had 30,000 chariots that they had come up with, 6,000 horsemen, and then this great army. So Israel and Jonathan are still in a heap of trouble. But then God shows up on the scene, right? The tides turn, right? God shows up on the scene. What happens? And that first strike which Jonathan and his armor bearer made killed about 20 men within about half a furrow's length of an acre. And there was a panic in the camp, in the field, and among all the people. This is the people of the Philistines. One soldier and his armor bearer show up, and they have a small fight. And suddenly, this overwhelming military force begins to panic. The soldiers in the field begin to tremble. It's as the earth quaked. And suddenly it's a very great panic. Right? From a military perspective, there's zero reason for the Philistines to panic. One guy showed up, he beat a few of the soldiers on the outskirts of the army. Not really a big deal. But God showed up on the scene. The Philistines are not unacquainted with God. A little bit more of the backstory here. In chapter 4 of 1 Samuel, the Philistines have a victory over the people of Israel. They capture the ark, the mercy seat of God on top of the ark. They carry it down into their cities, and they send it one by one to all the cities of the land. And as they do this, these great plagues come down on the Philistines. They begin by sending it to the temple of Dagon, one of their idols. And it says they wake up in the morning, and this huge statue of their idol, their God that they've put all their faith and trust in, has fallen down flat on its face before the ark of God. And sort of, we can imagine them kind of scratching their heads and saying, well, we'll set it up again. That must have been an accident. Right? And the next morning it says it had fallen down and hands had broken off and the head was shattered. And so they send it down the road to their neighbors, down to the city of Gath, right? And suddenly the city's breaking out in plague. Boils and rats are following the people throughout the city. And so they send it to another city and another city, right? And it goes around the whole nation. By the time it's made it through all 5 of the major cities in the land of the Philistines, they make this statement. They say to the lords of the Philistines, don't be hard-hearted like Pharaoh in Egypt was. Right? And in this statement, we see that they had heard of God's miraculous deliverance of his people Israel from Egypt. They had heard of this God who showed up, who destroyed the nation of Egypt, the mightiest military power in the Middle East at this time. They had heard the story of God's wrath and of his judgment. And they said, don't harden your hearts. This is the same God who is now bringing this judgment on us. About 20 years later, the Philistines apparently forgot. They come up against the nation of Israel again in 1 Samuel chapter 7. They come up when the people are renewing their covenant faithfulness with God. They say, oh, all the people are gathered together. This will be a perfect time. We can come up. We can capture them. We can bring them into subjugation again. And it says there that God, he thundered against the people, the Philistines who had come up, and he drove them away. Right. Can you imagine hearing the voice of God like thunder? And that was enough to literally drive the army of the Philistines away. And so again, these Philistines, they're not unacquainted with God's power. And so as the earth begins to shake, it's almost as if these memories, suppressed, attempted to be forgotten, they come back. Oh no. We've heard of this power of God, and he is here again. He has not forgotten his people. And so they literally flee. The panic in the camp causes such an uproar so rapidly that Saul and the rest of his soldiers who are hiding in the pomegranate cave, they hear the noise of the people panicking. And they come out, they look, they say, what's going on? Right? It says, the watchmen of Saul in Gibeah of Benjamin looked, and behold, the multitude was dispersing here and there. News travels fast in our day and age, right? I mean, it seems like everybody knows what's going on 5 minutes after it happens. You might find it a surprise they didn't have cell phones in ancient Israel, right? And somehow, so quickly, the whole camp of the Philistines is in panic. It spreads like wildfire. It defies explanation. It causes such an uproar that across the valley and up the hill on the other side, Saul's watchmen say, something's going on in the camp of the Philistines. And Saul comes out, and this is curious. He begins to inquire after God at the ark with the priest. And I say this is curious because we might ask ourselves, why didn't he do that in the first place? He was hiding in a cave with the priest, with the ark. Why didn't he ask earlier? But if we think about it for a second, this is, again, typically how I deal with problems, right? And lack of faith. We let fear consume us to the point that we just forget that we can go to God in prayer. We just forget that his eye is on the sparrow, and so he too is watching over us even more. Oftentimes we in fear try to solve the problem ourselves until it becomes abundantly clear that we've done nothing but make the problem worse. And then as a last-ditch effort, we turn to God to ask him what's going on. For us, it would be better if we started with prayer, right? If at the first sign of trouble, we went to God with it, right? But again, we can identify with Saul here that oftentimes our going to God is one of the last things on our mind. It becomes so abundantly obvious as they're standing at the ark praying, inquiring after God, that God is at work, that Saul says, never mind. God has made it clear. The camp of the Philistines is fleeing. And it says he goes up with the army of Israel. And they go into battle to deliver the nation, to participate with God. Verse 20, it says, they rallied with him and they went into battle. And behold, every Philistine's sword was against his fellow, and there was a great confusion. God so soundly destroys the Philistines that these men who were hiding in caves and in tombs somehow find the courage to rally up and go into battle. When we see God working, when we take time to simply slow down and look at what he's doing, look at what he's done, it gives us courage. Right? If you find yourself in fear and struggling in trial, simply take a moment to look at what God has done. Right? As we think about the great victory that he has over death and the grave, we too should find our courage to live faithfully. But oftentimes we kind of struggle just to take the time to do that. And again, this is where having a brother and sister in Christ to come along and encourage us becomes so helpful to us. Right? Jonathan and his armor bearer go up in faith. They start this action of faith in trusting in God to provide for the people a deliverance. Their small act of faith, combined with God's act to deliver, inspires, encourages, and gives courage to those who are hiding. Right? And look at these people who show up on the scene, who show up to the battle once God has begun to act. Look at them. The Hebrews who had been with the Philistines before that time and who had gone up with them. These are people who had forsaken their belief in God. They had literally joined the enemy. And they see God's people acting in faith, and they see the deliverance, the power that God has to save, and they turn from the sin that they have in joining the enemy, and they return to God. Likewise, when all the men of Israel who had hidden themselves in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were fleeing, they too followed after them to battle. These men who were hiding in caves, who were hiding in tombs, who had fled into the forest, these people who had allowed fear to dominate, who had allowed fear to overwhelm their faith, and they see, they hear what God is doing through his people, and they return. You'll probably find that there's people today who are living in fear the same way. You might find that there are some people who are going through difficulty to the point where they kind of give up and they hide from it. They lock themselves in the house. They don't want to talk to people anymore. They abandon their families. You'll probably also find that there's people today who are, again, going through trial, dealing with sin by running from it. who literally say, okay, this land that I'm living in is no good anymore. I'm going as far in the opposite direction as I can possibly get to get away from this. And again, you'll also probably find people who have said, I don't think God's capable of delivering at all. I'm going to go and support the enemy instead. Right. Today, we still have the same ability to act, to live in faith, and to proclaim the good news in the same way that Jonathan has proclaimed here, that nothing hindered God from delivering man from sin. That through the work of the cross, he's fixed all the problems. He's made it available by faith to experience salvation. That you no longer need to hide in fear. You no longer need to flee in fear. But that you can stand in courage with God in the work of salvation that he has accomplished. That your very actions, brothers and sisters, in trusting in God in the trial, that your actions in doing that can inspire those around you who are dealing with similar trials or with different trials. But they can inspire those around you who are dealing with trials to place their faith in God and trust in him too. Right? It doesn't have to be anything as miraculous as Jonathan charging into battle alone with his armor bearer. But you need to act in faith. Place your trust in God and act in faith, knowing that he's going to provide what's necessary. Knowing that he's working all things for good according to his purpose for those who love him. That he is bringing his end to completion. Your trust and your faith in God and how you live it out will then be a witness to those around you that God truly does save. People will look and say, how in the world did you get through that? How in the world did you show up day by day and go through that struggle? And you'll have the opportunity to tell them that with God, there's no limitation on his ability to deliver. Right? Nothing limits God. My imagination does not limit God from being able to deliver. My circumstances do not limit God from being able to deliver. And it might not always look like what I thought the best thing would be for deliverance. But we rest assured in the fact that God's deliverance is permanent and for eternity. Okay, so as we look at 1 Samuel 14, I hope that you're encouraged by Jonathan's statement of faith. That nothing limits God from saving his people. Not even our overwhelming burden of sin. So a few final thoughts here before we close for the evening. Again, as a reminder, be aware that the temptation of sin through fear is attempting to lead us to abandon the truth that God is our sole source of salvation, that he somehow is unconcerned or incapable of intervening. So if you find yourself believing those lies, recognize them, return to the truths of who God is, what he has done, the demonstration of his power to deliver. Secondly, don't be discouraged in the face of great trials. Jesus makes no false claim that we're going to experience a peaceful life as believers. In fact, he tells us you ought to be ready to experience persecution and tribulation and trial, even as I did. So don't be afraid. For if God's with you, there's none that can stand against you. We need to be reminded that faith results in action. If we claim to have faith, God can deliver, and then we run and we hide in the tomb. We're not really living out our faith, are we? Right, so faith, the belief that we have, the confidence that we have in God, leads to action. And acting in faith requires that we humbly submit to God's will first, that we're open to what his plan might look like, even when that contrasts with our plan. We recognize that God's plan, even though we might not be able to see it, is coming to a much better conclusion than we could have planned. And finally, we can recognize that as we live out our faith, that living out of our faith can be of great encouragement to one another. I know I said finally, but one more thing. Look at your brothers and sisters who are experiencing trial and recognize that they might need someone like Jonathan did, his armor bearer, to come and stand alongside him. Right? That might be you today. You might be the one experiencing trial. You might also be the one who is placed in an opportunity to go to encourage someone to stand alongside them. Don't hesitate to act in doing that. Step out in faith. You never know how a little encouragement can have great reward.